We live in an amazing city, and the history of our city is unlike any other city in America. And with me today is Governor Bob Miller, who wrote a fascinating book, Son of a Gambling Man, about, well, you being the son of Ross Miller. So the book really is an adventure into coming to Las Vegas, what it was like when your dad came here, a little bit about your dad's history, and then how that inspired your career. And well, you tell me, what was it about Ross Miller and Las Vegas that just connected for the two of them?
Well, you have to understand the early history of Las Vegas, and although the book is an autobiography, it really is a comparative analysis of my family and that metamorphosis change that occurred from the 1950s when we moved here till the present, as well as Las Vegas and the changes that occurred. So going back in time, 1955, there wasn't any conventional financing for hotels. There were very few hotels. They were all single-story, except for the Riviera, where my dad had a chance to buy in. And all of the people that came here to run gaming did it on a personal basis, and they had an experience in the gaming industry. Well, if you were experienced in the gaming industry anywhere else, it was illegal. So my father had learned his trade as a bookie in Chicago, and you don't learn that trade in an illegal capacity without having to at least deal with the people around you that can be characterized as part of the mob. But Las Vegas was the land of second chances, so when he came out and bought a small percentage of Riviera, he was one of many of the earlier founders of Las Vegas who got a second chance, went into legitimate gaming, and started an evolutionary process which I trailed throughout the book to where we are now.
At that time, it seemed like the state of Nevada and the Gaming Commission kind of understood that. I mean, they understood that we're in the gaming industry and that the people who understand this industry come from, you know, other than legal backgrounds. So how do we then transition this from an illegal venture into a, you know, well, I don't think they ever imagined it being as corporate as it is today, but at least into a tourist-generated legal activity?
Yeah, we were challenged because we were the only place that was having legalized gaming. So how do you structure it? It started with the tax commission, ultimately led to the gaming commission. In the early parts of the book, when I talk about my dad getting his initial license, he wasn't really mentioned, but the chairman of the board at that time was a man named Gus Greenbaum. Gus Greenbaum had been the person who, after Bugsy Siegel was murdered, stepped in the next day and said, "I'm in charge," and nobody disagreed with him. He ultimately became the chairman of the board of the Riviera, but 3 years into that, he and his wife were murdered in Phoenix, Arizona. So in the licensing process, and I quote part of it there, the gaming authorities, well, their predecessors, the tax authorities, had indicated that, you know, you have questionable background, Mr. Greenbaum and others that are here, but, you know, we're going to take it from here forward. And that was kind of the basic attitude. It's also true of law enforcement. I quote Ralph Lamb, who many people know here and has the TV show Vegas now on CBS. And Ralph had the same kind of attitude, was, you know, what you did there then is one thing, but now you have to play by our rules.
Well, that was a very progressive attitude, though, and it's really responsible for ultimately creating what we have here in Nevada.
Yeah, there was no conventional financing. In fact, the only place that money was obtained other than individual pockets was the Central State Pension Fund of the Teamsters Union. So in many respects, you could say Jimmy Hoffa was the landlord of Las Vegas, and so when he would come here, he was treated accordingly. And it was many years before we got into any conventional financing when Valley Bank, you know, the famous partnership of Perry Thomas and Jerry Mack, came in with some conventional financing. And as I chronologize in the book, eventually elements of mob influence and changed in their dynamics. But at the same time, we also had a metamorphosis in the financing. Howard Hughes was asked to move out of his floor of rooms at the Desert Inn Hotel and decided, no, I'll just buy the hotel. And then he bought another couple hotels. That was one of the big changes. And then Baron Hilton brought the Hilton Corporation in here, a publicly traded company. Ironically, one of the two properties they bought was the Flamingo. So Bugsy Siegel's place became corporate America.
Right.
And that started a trend that we've seen now that led to all the mega properties we have here, which is really Wall Street runs Las Vegas.
When you moved here in the 50s, what was Las Vegas like? The population was what, around 200,000 people?
About 50,000.
50,000?
55, yeah.
Okay.
And it was desert. I mean, it's hard for people to imagine what it was like. There were, like I said, very few hotels. They were all single-story ranch style. Right. The Riviera, when they built the 9 stories, were ridiculed because they said, why would you build a property where people have to use an elevator? There was desert in between these. You know, I was walking home from a movie one day, had to hit the ground because a dust storm was blowing through. For about 20 minutes, I had to lay there, but I would just get my face pitted. Everybody knew everybody. It was more friendly in a collegial sense at that point, and that's why a lot of people reminisce and say, oh, it was better when the mob ran Las Vegas. The mob never really did run Las Vegas, but when there was elements that were involved in gaming, it was more that we were just a small town, I think.
Right. And with no air conditioning, right? Some people some people credit air conditioning as being the #1 invention that is responsible for the growth of Las Vegas.
I would think it had a significant impact.
Yeah.
I can remember, and I mentioned in the book, going to Mass at St. Anne's Church, and it was really overcrowded at the time, and so people would have to stand outside, and the heat of the summer would be, you know, very difficult to take, and so they would dress accordingly, and finally the priest had to announce that if you're wearing a bathing suit, when you come to communion, please put something over it.
Did you ever, well, and you didn't you work as a lifeguard?
I did for several summers at the Riviera, yeah.
So did you ever expect to go into the casino business or the hotel business? I mean, you went to law school, but did you ever have thoughts of following what your father did?
If I had thoughts, they were gone really quickly because my father was adamant that I was not going to follow into his profession. We weren't even allowed to have a deck of cards in the house. He wanted something else, and he was true of, you know, that generation. If we think back, and our families, my dad was part of the World War II generation, born before World War I, and they just worked as hard as they could to get something better for their kids. So my dad had a GED from high school. My mother graduated from high school, but they were determined that I was going to go not only to college but beyond and to law school, which I did, and went a different route. In fact, I ended up in a law enforcement route, which is kind of ironical considering the historical component of not only my family but all of Las Vegas at that time.
Right. Because you worked part-time for the Sheriff's Department, you had a job there, and then you ultimately went in the Public Defender's office for a short period of time.
I was in the DA's office.
And DA's?
Yeah, not in the Public Defender. I was a Deputy District Attorney, right. And then Sheriff Lamb came to me. At that time, we had 2 different departments, right. The Sheriff's Department and the Police Department. Asked me if I'd be the attorney to the Sheriff's Department. So I worked it out, so I was doing both, the Deputy DA and Sheriff's Department. And then I became a judge,
right.
Lower Court judge.
Well, you were a Justice Court judge and then ultimately ran for District Attorney. Right. And did some great work in the District Attorney's office. You're known for creating victims' rights and creating a whole department and a whole process that really considered the victims. And you know what? I have some tape that I wanted to show.
Okay.
From, I think this is 1994, where you were at that time governor. And some surprising you, like, yeah, what's he going to show me?
Okay.
But you were governor, and you were running for re-election, and I was talking to you about the victims issue, as well as John Walsh, who you talk about in the book as well, who's a good friend of yours. Yeah. So let's take a look at this Bob Miller, who hasn't changed in 18 years,
right.
and me, who is much older 18 years later.
You know, I've been watching a lot of the political advertising this recent month, and you have a very effective ad that is done by John Walsh, supporting you. He's the national spokesperson. Well, why don't you tell me the story about how you met John Walsh?
Well, I'm very pleased and proud to have his support. I met John before he was ever a television persona, when he went through the greatest tragedy of his life, and one which would be difficult to have much more tragedy than anybody's life. His only child at the time, Adam, had been shopping with his mother, had become separated, was kidnapped, and later turned up murdered. And John was a businessman in Florida, had learned that there wasn't much in the way of a missing children's network at that time, and was just incensed by it and very concerned, started seeking federal legislation and was resisted in his efforts to do so. I was an officer of the National District Attorneys Association. Shortly thereafter, I became president of that association. And John came to us. There was a few of us in the executive board, and told us what was occurring and what his ideas were, and frankly, they were great ideas. And we put all our efforts into trying to help him get this through Congress, and we were successful, but really John deserves the credit for it. We tried to help. And I've worked with him since then. In 1982, I was one of 9 people that President Ronald Reagan selected to deal with victims of crime. And we gave a report to the President in December of that year. And John was one of the witnesses, and I, counseled with him a lot about his ideas on what we could do with victims of crime. And I've gotten to know him over the years. Since that time, they made 2 movies about his life, Adam, and then there was a sequel to it. And he evolved into the star of America's Most Wanted because of his zeal in dealing with the criminal element, particularly initially those with abducted or missing children, and then expanded into just those lifetime criminals. And a lot of people don't realize that that's how it all began. It's very pleasing to me to have his support.
Yeah, he's going to be in Nevada later this month?
He's going to be in Reno on the 24th of October, and we're going to spend some time together and probably have an event where we can invite people to come out and visit. He's not coming. He's coming also to give a speech that day, but he's coordinating it with me, and it's great to visit with him. What people don't, maybe on the personal side, they'd be interested to know that he and his wife, Hervé, are still together, a many-year marriage, which is a very difficult thing to do after you've suffered a trauma like that. There's an incredibly high divorce rate. And they now have 2 other children that were born subsequent to Adam. At the time, had been an only child, about a 6-year-old boy was an only child, but they now have a son and a daughter, Megan and Callahan.
Yeah, I can remember quite a while ago when you were a district attorney, now you either started the first or one of the first victim witness assistance programs in the country in the district attorney's office.
Yeah. The program itself started shortly before I was there, the victim witness assistance. What I did is immediately upon becoming district attorney was to create what we call a Citizens Committee on Victim Rights, which was to coalesce with all the agencies in the community that wanted to help crime victims, families of murder victims, community action against rape, TADC for domestic violence, etc., and asked them to be an advisory board to our office, specifically the Victim Witness Assistance Center. And I also created a policy that said we would not plea bargain or reduce a case without the express approval of the victim, or, if necessary, my own as district attorney, not all the 55 or so attorneys who were working in there. There was virtually no instance in which I overruled the victim in any case, but that was the first such policy in the United States. Then I also took to the legislature bills which we got passed and are still in place, a Victims' Bill of Rights, which allow for victims to testify at sentencing, allow input at parole hearings if desired, which provide them information and involvement, and also victims' compensation legislation, which provides a source of funding for some of the financial needs of victims that might not otherwise be compensatable. This is even in instances where we don't know who, or we have not apprehended the perpetrator, so they can still be eligible for it.
The parole board consists of you and the Attorney General and Secretary.
The Pardons Board.
Well, never got that question out. When you look back upon your time as a DA, is that one of the memorable things you've accomplished?
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
The victim rights were in their early evolutionary stages. I remember campaigning and a woman saying to me that she was incensed with the criminal justice system because her house had been burglarized and nothing had been done. Reality, the burglars were both in prison. Nobody bothered to say anything to her. And it was that kind of disjointed, ill-thought process that we were able to reform. So it was a privilege to be part of that.
You know, we kind of take it for granted today that that's part of the process, but in that day it was really novel.
No, it was unusual. Certainly the plea bargaining part that I put in really hasn't even to this day been mirrored by many, but I thought it was effective. It was a way of getting people to feel that they were part of the process, because they were the ones that suffered the crime, and therefore they should be consulted on what the result would be.
And after you served as district attorney, you became ran for lieutenant governor. Why did you want to give up the job as DA and enter the race for lieutenant governor? And Richard Bryan was running for governor at the time.
Right. Dick Bryan, when he first ran for governor a couple years before, 4 years before, had approached me when I was in the middle of my 2 terms as DA and asked if I would consider running for Attorney General. And I wanted to be reelected DA. Nobody had been reelected DA in Las Vegas previously. And I also had a chance to be president of the National DAs, all of which occurred, as you heard from that tape. So at the end of that 8 years of DA, he approached me again and said he was now governor, that he was going to be running for re-election. He'd like me to consider running for lieutenant governor. And I thought about it, and I said, you know, I'm the first DA ever been re-elected. You know, I've done a lot of these things on the national level for victim rights, and I've been the president of the National DAs. What am I going to be, the grand old man of the DAs? No. What's next? What can I try next? And so lieutenant governor was appealing. It was part-time. It allowed me to get in the private sector, see how that felt. And there was the very distinct prospect that he was going to run in the middle of his second term for the United States Senate, which he did and was successful, and that made me governor. However, it was not without the specter of my family and the early history of Las Vegas coming up by my political opponents in every campaign.
Right, and so they brought up your father, and they made allegations and insinuations regarding your father, and there was also a controversy about whether the time that when Dick Bryan resigned, and there was a time period of whether or not you had to run or not run. So you had those 2 issues to deal with. Why don't you talk about those 2 issues?
Well, I assume by the latter you're talking about my last election for governor.
Right.
When I served the expiration of Dick Bryan's term, I served 2 years and about 3 days, and then I was elected. And so I'd served 6 years and 3 days in effect. And so the Nevada Constitution related to this provided that if you serve more than half of a person's unexpired term, that counts as a full term, and you can only be elected governor for 2 4-year terms. So there was the suggestion and actually a legal challenge to my filing for election in my last election based on the fact that I'd served about 3 days more. The attorneys that in the Attorney General's office, but private attorneys that I'd hired, concluded that it didn't really mean a literal 2 years because of the variance of the calendar, because 2 years hence it could have been 1 year and 363 days. It was just the way it fell first Monday. And so that argument, eventually the Supreme Court really never addressed it directly. They just said, I don't know, let the voters decide. And so I was deemed eligible, ran, and was elected. And so I'm either described as the longest serving governor in Nevada history, or some might say the longest serving governor in Nevada history.
But initially, when you ran the first time, then they brought up the issue about your dad.
Yeah, in every political election I had, my dad had passed away before I held any public office, but the specter of him was involved in every campaign. My opponents were always suggesting that because he had come from the background he did, and they wanted to ignore the fact that everybody in the industry had come from that background, and because he knew people having been in that background, that somehow that bootstrapped to me and made me unqualified, made me suspect, and therefore I shouldn't be elected. Fortunately, I had a lot of years in law enforcement and a lot of law enforcement officials supporting my candidacy and talking about my character, and was able to overcome it. I was successful in all my elections.
What is your feeling about, even today, when somebody's father, somebody's spouse, somebody's child is brought up and you have a candidate running, is that fair game to bring up other acquaintances or family friends or family relatives to try to impeach a potential candidate?
I think it certainly should be very limited. I don't think it reflects necessarily upon the person, the candidate, but I live this, so I am sensitive to it. I suppose that it can have some relevance, but it generally goes way beyond that in the way of political attacks. It's not fair. It's nasty, and that's how politics in general have become, unfortunately. Most people, I think, if they go to vote and pay attention, they react negatively to undue political attacks, but certainly they have to be responded to. And so if your opponent chooses to do that, you have to have a response for it.
Your son, Ross Miller, named after your father, is Secretary of State. Now, does he have to deal with this issue because it was his grandfather?
He hasn't in his first 2 elections for Secretary of State, and as I conclude the book, I talk briefly about that, and I think that you know, he lived in a different era of Nevada, and certainly so far removed, I can't see anybody, you know, kind of bootstrapping to his grandfather through him. So I think that part's fortunate.
Yeah, well, I think it cleared the forest for him on on that issue. Of all these jobs you've had, the work, you know, the district attorney, being a judge, being governor, what was your favorite job?
I enjoyed both district attorney and governor for different reasons. District attorney, you're kind of wearing the white hat. You're trying to protect victims. You're trying to keep criminals off the street. It was very succinct and single purpose. But governor is an incredible opportunity to make a difference for the future of the state and the citizens of it, and it covers a wide variety of issues, and so it's a challenge, which I loved, to be able to deal with something that related to the water that was necessary, and the next minute be dealing with a criminal justice issue, and you know, then the next, how do we get more money for roads, and so on. So, you know, being governor is probably the most enjoyable, but it's so time demanding and intense that, boy, it just goes by and you don't even realize it.
And of course, you had to leave Las Vegas, move your family up to Carson City, and raise your children at the governor's mansion. What was that like?
Well, we kept our residence here as well, but the governor's mansion is really just a house in a neighborhood in Nevada, which I outline some in the book. But the Carson City environment at the time was very small. There was about 40, 50,000 people. It was kind of like going back to the old Las Vegas, but without the casinos. You know, you could go anywhere there, and you were just you. You weren't the governor. And you come back to Las Vegas, which even by then, that point in time, you know, had a million or so people, and they were, especially those that moved from California, were stunned to see you if you went to a grocery store or a movie, which I had the habit of doing, or playing basketball, which I did, you know, frequently. So you were more on as a showpiece in Las Vegas. In Carson City, you were just one of the people in the neighborhood. It was a nice environment for raising our family, but Sandy and I are both from Las Vegas, so you know, it was always our home, and I think, you know, our children probably consider both home, but probably perhaps more here.
And when you look back upon the research you did for the book, is there a particular person who you wish you had more information about that you just didn't have at the time?
Probably it's not as complete as I would like it to be in any case. I mean, we did a lot of research. I had help putting it together, obviously, and you know, there's conclusions that you can reach from trying to piece together this person here or there in the book, because the early history of Las Vegas was fascinating. I mean, and we take you through my dad's era, you know, up into the movie Casino. I was DA by that time, the Spilatro era. And then the evolution to the present day. There's just fascinating people in here. My wife says that there's an element of the book that characterizes me as Forrest Gump. I hope she doesn't mean personality, but she does mean that I happen to be interacting with famous people at various times just by coincidence. And it wasn't when I was governor. At different stages in here, you'll hear mention of Barbra Streisand, Bobby Kennedy, Michael Douglas, Mikhail Gorbachev, etc. And I have been very fortunate to interact with Jimmy Hoffa. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think there's things of interest to anybody that cares about the history of Las Vegas, or you know, our community, or maybe the challenges that a person like myself can face.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a theory on like some of the, like you talked about Gus Greenbaum, and he was murdered, but wasn't really solved, was it?
No, the Greenbaum murder was never solved, neither was Bugsy Siegel for that matter. Right. You know, I think there's reasonable suspicion, if you consider the history, that Greenbaum, who at the time was noted to be a little loose with his money, you know, might have been murdered by the mob for not taking care of their share of the money at that particular point in time. But as I said, no one ever was arrested or convicted of his murder.
And what about Jimmy Hoffa? You have a theory on that?
Probably similar. You know, although obviously you haven't recovered his body, you don't know who did anything of that nature. But there was reason to believe that there were elements of connection between the Teamsters Union funds and perhaps some underworld influences. some of the historical component. If you put all those pieces together, a lot of people like my dad had connections in that way, because that was the earliest financing. It was the only way to open a hotel in Las Vegas. We wouldn't be here if we had today's standards then, because they wouldn't have worked. We couldn't have had anybody come in and run gaming that had no experience doing it.
Right, and your dad was involved, at least peripherally, in what the Circus as well, and the Riviera, and the was the Bingo Palace at the time, or something? Was he,
no, my father was
Thomas?
misinformation.
Yeah.
That, my father was never involved in the Bingo Palace.
Okay.
He owned, after the Circus, he owned half of the Slots of Fun with a man named Carl Thomas, who, my dad had died, and Carl Thomas was arrested and indicted in a skimming case for the Tropicana Hotel and ultimately the Stardust Hotel with members of, allegedly members of organized crime. But you know, my dad was in the Chamber of Commerce. You know, he was president of the Shrine. He was, you know, like many of the reformed gamblers that came here, you know, he became a respected businessman.
And that's what Las Vegas always offered. Hey, a way of resetting your life and making change. And a lot of people have moved here then and now for that reason, you know?
Definitely true.
You get a clean start.
Yeah, it's, I mean, the industry, gaming industry is regulated much more restricted now than it was then. And as I said, Wall Street kind of runs Las Vegas now. The irony is my dad didn't want me involved in gaming. I wasn't for almost all of my life, and now I'm on the Wynn Resorts Board of Directors and the IGT Board of Directors. So I am involved in gaming, but the gaming that I'm involved in is nothing like the one my father was involved in, or I suspect wouldn't have the reasons for pushing me away from it that he did when he was alive.
Well, there is nobody who has been the observer, the Forrest Gump of Las Vegas, more so than you, having seen this incredible transition from the 50s to the present Las Vegas, from the mob to the corporate world to 50,000 people to 2 million people. I mean, and all the positions and all the influence and the responsibility you have for making this a great town. So it's a great read. Son of a Gambling Man, Governor Bob Miller. Pick it up online. We're at whatever bookstore is still left. Right? Barnes & Noble.
Yeah.